the lads gave me this wonderful biography of Dr. Eric Schmidt, and I could read it to you, but instead I could just ask him to come up on stage and we'll talk a little bit, and then you can ask him some questions yourself.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you all.
Okay, now I wanted to spend a minute or two on how we got here because, I wrote about apps, and as part of that, I looked deeply in your biography. Online, you can find memos you wrote at Cal. Yeah, digitize everything and pay the rest of your life. I can find memos you wrote when you were studying networking in college, and you're talking about the need for people to contribute equally. Yeah, right. Embarrassing as it may be. But then, Sun Microsystems, obviously, Google is maybe the first major company that grew up assuming the web. It was a given. Others were pioneers in it, but it was given for them. Spend a minute on how apps came to be an important part of the company.
Well, I think one of the things, first place, I'm really glad that you all have spent your day here, and I hope this has been well worth your time. We really appreciate it. Everybody here is really, really busy. If you go back and you look in history, the problems that we all face today are the same problems we had 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. But the technology solutions are quite different, and the industrial structure is quite different. But if you go back, you can see that the themes, which had to do with mainframe computing, time sharing, portable computing, the notion of mobility, the notion of moving data around, have been present for a long, long time. And I think as you get older, you sort of appreciate the value of history because you experience a little bit of it. Maybe that's how my view. But for example, much of the network computing discussion that was done now was really announced by Larry Ellison and others with the network computer in 1997. Now, they didn't work at all.
Yeah, it didn't work.
It didn't work at all. But it doesn't mean the argument wasn't right. It's just the product didn't work, right? Which is sort of embarrassing for those of us that participated in it. And so one of the questions that you want to ask is what has changed? And the thing that has changed is this enormous march of technology, the Moore's Law, all the things that you all know, have made it possible to now to do things that we only dreamed of a few years ago. Mm-hmm. If I go back to Java, write once, run anywhere, the solution was something people needed. In fact, most people use non-Java solutions, but they achieve write once, run anywhere because of things like the way the web applications, which are JavaScript, are implemented or based. Mm-hmm. So that's ultimately, I think, where it comes from. For example, Sun, when I joined in 1983, had a diskless computer. Mm-hmm. Well, Google has announced a diskless computer for shipment later this year. And I explained to people that we announced this when you all were born. Right? Which is, you get no credit for this.
It's going to work this time, right?
And it worked then. It helped build a great company. Yeah. And of course, it was a 1 MIPS computer as opposed to a 1 gigahertz computer. But it was a fine computer at the time.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've built these internally and used them internally and liked them. But why take them out in the world in the sense of why take your eye off the ball from search? That's a really nice business to be in. You're making a ton of money. Why allocate all these resources towards that?
Well, partly because people think of Google as a search company. Google is an information
That's the $20 billion you make from it.
But we don't run the company for that reason. We run the company around information. And all of those wonderful people that are trapped behind corporate firewalls are not some subclass, right? Yeah. They have important and specialized needs that we need to serve, and we need to serve them very, very well. And what's interesting about these web apps is that you can do these sharing solutions now that are really substantially different applications when used. And if there's anything we all can speak about a company, it's that companies are about sharing. So one of the sort of new things in the last 5 years about the web has been that it enables sharing sensitive apps. Classic example is calendars. Now, I think of calendars as incredibly boring, right? But I'm wrong. Calendars are incredibly interesting because they're highly shared. So from a computer science perspective, all of a sudden we have our top engineers who want to build calendars of all things. I'm going like, what's wrong with you guys? Mm-hmm. But in fact, it's a very interesting example. Spreadsheets are similar. The most interesting spreadsheets are highly, highly interlinked, something I didn't know and was not possible with the previous technology, Microsoft technology, mm-hmm. Which made it very difficult because they weren't built into that model.
And it's interesting to that end that even in search, you were leveraging collaboration. Yeah. You were leveraging the way people link to other sites and observing it in a new way. That was the power.
The key insight, I think, in all of these architectures is that you can have open data exchange interfaces. We have something called GData. And applications are no longer these monolithic applications. That corporations, individuals, and so forth, are all basically building applications out of the equivalent of scripts. And it's much, much more cost-effective than trying to build these large IT applications, which, as we all know, end up showing up a couple years later and much more expensively.
Yeah, but the nice thing about those large IT applications was it did create a kind of certainty for the vendor, the consumer, and the organization.
Certainty of being late, expensive, complex, and inflexible? Or did I miss something?
Certainty that the other guy had the same problems you did.
They were a great source of revenue when I was running that business. I loved it.
How things have changed.
That's right.
But nonetheless, now there's a kind of uncertain world because we are transiting to a model Janine was talking about. We've been talking about all day in various ways involving scale of collaboration.
But I'm assuming people are here probably because you want to sort of figure out what that new model looks like.
Yeah, and it's here and you better live with it.
That's sort of the joint problem that we all face.
But do you think there is a kind of search for certainty among CIOs and CEOs about what this world's going to look like and how to prepare for it?
Well, first place, I would prefer a simpler answer than a more complicated answer.
Yeah.
And I think that the simpler answer is that to the degree that you can move your applications to the cloud internally, you'll have more flexibility because you'll have standardized interfaces. And most of the entrenched vendors say that, but they don't in fact deliver it. And it's easy to take pot shots at Microsoft. If you take a look, for example, at the DLL architecture for Windows Server, you discover that it's essentially impossible to have a client that's not a Windows client. Right? Now, independent of anything else they say, it prevents you from giving a choice. Mm-hmm. Now, if you don't want that choice, it's fine. But if you do want that choice, then you need to understand that it's a limit. It's interesting that at Google, we're getting ready to deploy these essentially Android and Chrome-based devices that are in development. And so we want, of course, to eat our own dog food. This is how we sort of build things. And so I said, OK, good. Let's imagine that from this day forward, everything we did was a perfect web app. Mm-hmm. What would the world look like? Well, even in our own, this is a company which has clearly has the religion. We found applications that were part of our business operations, sales, accounting, and so forth and so on, that were relatively non-strategic. They were highly tied to a specific vendor or a specific platform. And they're in the process of being rewritten, and it's no big deal, and it's not that hard. You put a front end on them, make them more web capable, make them browser resident. But even at Google, we have this problem. So I suspect everybody faces this problem. It's very real.
OK, well, since you brought up Microsoft, let's handicap the world a little bit. Who's an interesting player here, either through incumbency, size, interesting ways of thinking about this, people you'd want to collaborate with, people you see as a competitor in an interesting way?
Well, the goal here is to serve the customer here in the room. And virtually everybody here has a multi-platform solution. All of us, including, I should say, Microsoft, are trying to move to this new web model. So everybody has their literature. And I think you have to try it. You have to see if it actually works. There are limitations. For example, our applications are not full replacements for the incumbents. Mm-hmm. And we're very clear about that. We're very honest about it. And in fact, our strategy for most of them is not to get to 100%, but to get to 80%. Because if we can get to 80% because of our cost benefit and because of our flexibility, we think we can provide some real value. And the cost of replicating all of the 20 years worth of development that is represented by the predecessors isn't worth the value, because corporations are moving forward anyway, and you can get enough done with the 80% solution. Mm-hmm. An interesting statistic is that we have a couple million enterprise customers now for our Google Apps Suite. We're adding on the order of 3,000 businesses, now these are typically very small, per day to this. We have large institutions coming in once a week or two, turning on 20 or 30,000 such customers. So we have the operational experience to say with some certainty that these systems actually work at scale. And lots and lots of examples where 4 nines reliability. These are global services, on and on and on. And we obviously use it ourselves. One
of your own skills is not just managing at scale, but it's observing and making new kinds of patterns and products from scale. What are you seeing as people sign up to this?
Well, it's better to describe it as what do you all complain about once you're sort of getting started with us. And the most interesting complaint is the things that you didn't realize that you wanted that you now want because you have the sharing and the interconnection model. Mm-hmm. And the ones that I think are most interesting are the ones that involve very, very sophisticated workflow. virtually everybody here has very specialized document retention policies. That there are all sorts of really good reasons, change management policies, all very good reasons for corporations. We, Google, have these systems. And yet most of the systems that are in place are fairly restrictive in what you want to do. So we've sort of identified that once you have everything in the web and you have on these secure web servers, there are a lot of applications that can be built on top of this. They can be built by your own team using relatively straightforward tools that we make and that others make. But there are also third parties that are developing this. We brought out something called the Google App Store, not particularly distinguished name, but we announced it last month. And it seems to be growing very, very quickly. And it's third parties that do this sort of thing. They do finance apps, data tracking apps, and so forth. So what we sort of concluded was that our best strategy was to provide the interoperability platform, the sharing platform, the authentication platform, and then have these more vertical apps be built by third parties who can then sort of figure out what is really needed. And that also has the property that it enables your own developers to have a proper and stable platform. In other words, it really is a platform play here. And it's extensible because it's all web-based.
Okay. Let's spend a minute on the future, both for the product and inside the corporation, what kind of relationship you want to have with businesses. For starts, we saw Chrome OS, Chrome browser. There's a report today about Android Pad. How many computers you want to make?
Well, hopefully somebody else besides us is making them, and we're
Sponsor.
Hopefully we're enabling the software platforms. Let me back into the answer by a different statement. What's really important right now is to get the mobile architecture right, because mobility will ultimately be the way in which you provision most of your services. Now, today, that seems crazy, because today the mobile devices are largely a problem in a corporation because they don't fully support all the existing enterprise apps and so forth. But if you fast forward 5 or 10 years with the investment and growth in mobile computing, the kinds of things that you can do with mobile devices, and mobile devices here includes very small devices all the way up to very large tablets, even if you think of it as netbooks. So mobility is part of it. And the way I like to articulate it is that the answer should always be mobile first. In other words, you should literally put your best team and your best app on a mobile app that enables some business process. And by the way, everybody has these, right? Because every company ultimately has people who are moving forward. They're in motion. They're with their customer, so forth. Imagine they're all obvious sales tracking, material tracking kind of applications. Mm-hmm. If that's where all the real action is going to be, then making sure you know what's going on those mobile devices within the firm, because your employees will come in and they'll want interoperability, they'll want security and safety, turns out to be really important. From our perspective, the single most interesting development has been the arrival of the HTML5 standard, which everybody but Microsoft has embraced as the next step in browsers. So in particular, Mozilla and Safari, as well as Chrome and so forth. This standard allows for stored value within the browser. It also allows for application segregation, so you can write applications that don't trounce on each other. It means that applications will be much, much less virus sensitive, which is a huge issue for all of you. Google, having gone through a very sophisticated attack, is particularly now paranoid about this kind of stuff. And so we're very, very focused on making sure this stuff is much, much more secure. The promise of Chrome and Chrome OS is that the devices that you give to your employees will have a 2-second boot time, that they'll be completely disposable, and of course the price point is incredibly low.
I was going to ask you about that. You know, you're talking about having this OS out in 6 months. Presuming it goes 2 years from now, a device that is anonymous until it's immediately personalized in some massive way connected to the cloud is available for IT, and if it breaks, basically it's like a chair. You just throw it in the closet.
If you think about it, almost all of the historic problems...
What's it going to cost?
Well, it'll be up to the manufacturers that do it. But the price points that you all should think about are the current netbook pricing, which is in the $300, $400 kind of price points. And those prices are completely determined, by the way, by the cost of the glass, the cost of the processor, and things like that. In our case, Chrome OS and Android are free, so there's no software tax associated with all of this.
Could you see yourself selling it like a phone company, where you just throw it in as a plus for a 2 or 3 year contract?
Well, the phone, again, if the phone company chose to do that, that would be great. And many of the phone companies we've talked with do have enterprise.
No, but in terms of selling apps, I mean, could you just throw a device on top of it as part of an apps contract?
Oh, sure. Although we're not in that business, remember. Right.
Yeah.
Right. We're not in that business. I mean, we're basically in the advertising and enterprise software business, not in that business. And I don't think we'll go that far.
Okay.
But we'll see. You never know. I mean, we're trying to build a whole new industry.
Well, there you go.
If you think about it, there has not been a new successful platform in this space in 20 years. And I've worked on, as you pointed out in my history, I've had, a few failures along the way.
I didn't put it that way.
You were very kind.
Yeah.
So
I let them draw their own.
if there's anybody who understands how hard this stuff is, it's sort of me personally, and the team that we've assembled is particularly good. But if you go back to what we're trying to do, we're trying to develop a new set of platforms. It's a platform at every level. It's a device platform, it's an input platform, it's a mobility platform, it's a communications platform, it's an applications platform, it's a data sharing platform. The combination of all of that is incredibly powerful. And so the effect of this is, if you look at most of your costs, they seem to be related to the management of ambiguously owned devices. Does the employee own the device? Does the corporation own the device? Does the device have games on it? Does it have personal stuff on it, and so forth? We solve all that problem at once, right? Because of the combination of the cloud and the fact that the Chrome OS devices are essentially diskless. They have a cache, but not a permanent disk.
I may be the only person in the room thinking this, but I don't think so. I am email, video, voice. Is there such a thing as overkill in communication?
No.
I mean, how will... Okay. I mean,
you're obviously not young enough anymore.
Well,
right? Try finding an 18-year-old. Right? Watch what they do. Right? The level of input. Right? In fact,
I know we don't have an off switch, but have you found in using all this you need some new discipline of time management?
Many people have searched for an off switch for their teenager. Trust me, it just doesn't work. One of the questions that you want to really ask about this is, at the end of the day, what is new? Right? What is new? If you go back to what we're building, what we've built together over the years, what is really new? And I think there is one thing that's really new. That everything is now. That what you're really referring to is not the fact that you have so many parallel streams, but the fact that they're all current.
And also,
right?
They never sit at their desks and just work.
Well, then you don't need to give them a desk, which lowers your office overhead. You understand this. You're a reporter.
Born to sell.
No, we've talked for years for conduing, right? Here's a perfect example of conduing. I think all of us figured out that, now with a modern data connection and a powerful computer, you can pretty much work anywhere. My only issue in life is time zones.
Right.
Aside from time zones, I'm pretty productive pretty much everywhere I go. And I think that's the new executive lifestyle. But getting back to this question of information overload, what is fundamentally different now is that everybody knows what's going on exactly now.
Yeah.
And one way to express that is, imagine for the moment, everybody here has a digital device, turn it off. Turn it off right now. What have I just taken away from you? Something pretty profound. Your connectivity to that whole world, your personal world, your professional world, and so forth. That connection is so fundamental to people's lives today, whether it's personal or professional, that's not going to happen. We want to enable that to be more organized, right? So if you think about the information problem, interesting statistics, between sort of the birth of the world and 2003, there were 5 exabytes of information created. That's the total over that period. So that includes most of our adult lives, and children's lives, and so forth and so on. In the last bit, we create 5 exabytes in 2 days. So plot that curve as a power law curve. And now you understand why it's so painful to sort of operate in these information markets. The information explosion is so profoundly larger than anyone ever thought, certainly larger than I thought, that's what this opportunity creates.
Okay. I think we'd like to open it up for questions now. By the way, those 5 exabytes, I can subtract the tweets about Jersey Shore and stuff, right?
Trust me,
size is not equal quality.
The tweets are not the bandwidth problem, trust me. If there's anything that's not contributing to the bandwidth explosion, it's 140 character updates.
Please step up and have questions.
Questions or comments?
Any questions? He is the head of Google.
Yes, sir.
Hi. I am Bryson Kaler from IHG.
Right.
Thanks for having us here today. My question is, as CEO, what are you doing to help create the spirit of innovation and the culture of kind of the original .com environment now that you've probably grown into a slightly more bureaucratic organization? What are you doing to kind of keep that spirit alive?
It's an important question for the evolution of these, high-tech companies that go through, hypergrowth, IPO, and so forth, ultimately the culture of a company is determined not by the CEO, but by the people, right? And we work very hard to run the company based on a set of values, exemplified by many controversial decisions which are well publicized. From our perspective, it's all fundamentally about the people and the selection of the people that we bring into the company. And we end up selecting a pretty narrow set, by the virtue of our tough recruiting and so forth, and they tend to stay. So I think that the culture was sort of set as a smaller company, and it's a culture around focusing on end users, focusing on creativity, and doing things which are disruptive. And I think that people carry around that every day. What we look for, the reason we were talking about some of the technology things, we're looking for the next incredible thing that you can do with web services inside of an enterprise. So far, we've come up with very clever editors, very clever spreadsheets, very clever calendars, very clever ways of tracking changes and so forth. But there's another one, and we want to invent that, or we want to have a partner that invents it. And I think that's what defines the culture. We've tried to stay away from focusing on our competitors. We've tried to focus on innovation and end-user solutions. And we're blessed that we're in an advertising business which is lucrative. And we're also blessed in the enterprise space with products which are inexpensive relative to the competitors. And so the feedback from our customers is all about adding more features, increasing reliability, better integration, as opposed to the classic business problems. So Google is an unusual company because we framed the problem as one around innovation. And the moment we lose that, the company is toast, right? That's how fundamental it is. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I think that's a rough report on it. I mean, one of the things that I'd like to tell you is that we're still running 3-person teams that change the world. But the fact of the matter is that what we do is now complicated enough that the teams are bigger and they look a lot more like traditional enterprise companies. And I think that's just the process of the scale and things at the scale that we do. But we have been able to maintain the 20% time. So people are encouraged to work on things which they find interesting 20% of the time. They're not sufficiently exciting people that they do anything that's particularly different from what they currently do, right? But they're engineers after all. But they tend to actually create some very interesting new ideas. And a lot of our new stuff comes from the 20% time.
Okay.
You alluded to I guess the breach or near breach associated with what some have termed the advanced persistent threat. And I'm wondering, are there security lessons that you can share with us from what you've learned? Because it sounds like you were probably the most open of the companies that actually got hit. And given the, I guess the exposure that all of us face, I'm interested in any lessons learned from your perspective.
Well, when we were attacked, we faced a sort of a moral question, because most companies would be embarrassed to say it. But again, it's an example of how Google is an unusual company. We in fact decided we had to tell people as a warning. And as is known, there was also evidence of tracking of human rights activists and that sort of stuff, which again we publicized. And there's been a lot of coverage and knowledge that's occurred post that, which I think has been helpful for people's awareness of what was going on. We have not gone into the specifics of the attack, except that it was ultimately publicized that it was a vulnerability in IE6 that started it, and there's a patch and so forth and so on. So the simplest advice I would offer to you is, first and foremost, make sure throughout your company that you're using the latest versions of operating systems and browsers. Most people are not, because they don't think there's such a big threat. But now, because of the interconnectedness, if you get hold of one down-rev system, which is roughly what happened in our case, it's possible to then author credentials and basically begin to spoof, and through a series of steps, which I'd rather not go into for obvious reasons, actually ultimately get into some very serious parts of the company. We have done all of the obvious things since then. We've tightened up our perimeter defenses. We've upgraded all of our software. We're moving away from some of those systems to systems which are more web-dependent. We ultimately believe, and you should hold us to this, that the web services and web platforms that we're building over the next year will be inherently more secure. So for example, the Chrome and Chrome OS is focused around speed, simplicity, but also fundamentally security. And the way it does security, and some of this is understood and has been publicized, is it actually distrusts the application by definition, as opposed to trusting the application by definition. And that is a new sort of design principle that's not been present in the industry before.
Chuck Half, City of Pittsburgh.
Hi, Chuck.
Sort of looking at the web apps, sharing information differently perspective, and thinking about digital divide and sort of economic, socioeconomic differences, recognizing that irrespective of one's economic needs or means, in an urban or rural environment, many people have cell phones or PDAs
Sure.
or things like that. But how do you really deal with applications from the Google perspective that really makes a difference to that sense of community of the fundamental day-to-day economic differences? I mean, we know people will personally invest in great cable programming even though they may not have trouble surviving in school.
Sure.
So how do you see Google's role, sort of that social side at the ground level in that urban environment?
We see ourselves as a platform provider and not as a content provider. We're obviously sympathetic to the cause, but we're computer scientists. We're not experts in these areas. One of the things I'm most proud of is that in the next few years, more than 1 billion people will get mobile phones who've never had a mechanism for communicating outside of their village. And they're going to join the global communications emphasis. God knows what they're going to say. The new languages, new systems, and so forth. And we should all be very proud of that. We'll go from our lives there being almost no public communication for most people to almost everyone having a voice during our adult lives. And that's pretty amazing. From our perspective, we operate in a declining cost industry where the products actually get cheaper. So it's possible to imagine that in the next few years, the combination of the applications that I'm describing, sort of sophisticated Android-based devices, sophisticated Chrome-based browsers, enable the construction of communications sharing sites and so forth that are effectively free for the communities that you're talking about. And they have all the same needs as everybody else to communicate, to diagnose their problems, to share information, and so forth and so on. Outside of the United States, we've worked very hard for things like SMS search, because the poorest of the poor have an SMS phone, not a web-capable phone. So we have an SMS focus, which I think for most corporations is not that relevant. And then we have sort of a feature phone focus around these browsers. Most people in the future will access the internet mostly from their mobile device. It doesn't necessarily mean within a corporation, but in the consumer space, it's true. So again, all of us face the goal, if we want to reach all of possible consumers, we have to have a mobile-centric solution.
Kevin Kapp with the Tanacast Rock.
Hi, Cass.
I was thinking about Google Analytics and how great it was about telling us how people used our websites. Are you planning on having a Google Analytics for Google Apps? And what do you think it'll tell us about how our employees are using it?
Always a dangerous question, right? To find out what people really do with your systems. We are developing such tools targeted at the real usage pattern. Right now, almost all of our focus is on getting the core application suite out. So that would be mail, calendar, collaboration, all the various docs functionality, and getting them to that 80% functionality goal that I discussed earlier. And so you can imagine lots of interesting things. The most obvious one has to do with the level of sharing that actually goes on in the company. And I'm fascinated by the question of, for example, inside of Google, we talk about sharing, we talk about community, but how stovepiped is our decision-making really? And it will be possible for us to instrument and diagnose that. And we'll get started and see what kind of insights we can come up with. And that will be very helpful, I think, to everybody.
Hi, Eric. Brij Gupta from Tata Consultancy Services. I've been watching Google for the last 4 or 5 years since my college days. It has evolved as an organization in multiple areas. Today, you're competing with IBM, Microsoft, Apple, and now mobile phone manufacturers, and maybe many more areas I'm not aware of. What's your vision of Google 3 or 5 years from today? What kind of organization you see in form of Google?
As a company, Google is likely to be we're growing, so we'll have more people, more operations globally. And I think it's reasonable to assume that I think all of us were severely affected by the recession and the global financial collapse. And it looks like a global recovery is underway. We can debate the rate of growth. So I think a reasonable assumption is Google will be a larger company, a larger footprint doing things. I think I've touched on some of the areas of emphasis. We're extremely, in the enterprise, we're obviously extremely interested in building out the platform that I'm describing. And the platform involves cloud services, it involves the kind of data services, and then the platforms that people will use on a day-to-day basis. We won't replace everything. This is not a us versus them kind of thing. We have to interoperate, we have to offer, but we think we can offer a lower cost, better integrated, more useful, more multi-platform solution. So that's clearly a function. In the area of search, there's a lot of things that we can do now because of the power of our computing. It's really as close to AI as possible. Classic example is the Chrome browser on April 1st, always a great day to announce new products, by the way. We put in a button which automatically translates all of the web pages into your language. So you go, oh, pretty good. It's a huge deal, right? It's not a little deal. It's a little deal for us because we all speak English. It's a huge deal for a lot of people. So that's an example of something we can do. We introduced a product called Google Goggles, which you take a picture of things, and then it does, what it actually does is it goes out to, I don't know how many sets of server farms, but a whole bunch, and it says, is this a fruit, is this a plant, is this a menu, is this voice translation, is this a landmark, is this a face, and so forth. They vote of what the object is, and then they tell you what they think the object is, and it's spooky. Right? So take a picture of a landmark, it'll tell you what it is and take you to the Wikipedia page and things like that. That kind of technology is as close to magic as I can imagine. To me, I go, oh my God, we can do that. So we're very, very interested in moving the understanding of information, because of this information explosion, to this next level. But we operate under the assumption that people will carry mobile devices with them all the time, that those mobile devices will be always connected, that they will, for the one data network or another, for obvious reasons, and that there are applications that we can build or that others can build on top of our platform that will materially make them more productive, better at work, have more fun, be better entertained. And that's, I think, a unifying principle for you.
I think I'm getting the just one last question song.
Well, let's do the last two. We have two gentlemen
good
here.
deal.
Oh, it looks like we have a third person. Oh, yeah, that's right. We'll do three. We'll do them quick. Yes, sir.
Hey, Farland here from Sheepdog Inc. We're actually an integrator of Google Apps, so you've been preaching to the converted all day.
Oh, perfect.
Big fans. Question of a general nature. Warren Buffett says that when you acquire great wealth, you find yourself in more interesting circles, more interesting situations. I'd be interested to know what, maybe in the last year, what one or three things you've learned that have literally knocked your socks off.
I think that's addressed to you.
I think that I was quite surprised at the severity of the financial crisis. And to the degree that I was part of the administration and part of the reviews and so forth, I was really quite surprised that so many smart people knew so little about what was going on. And one of the things that I decided to work on was to try to fix that problem. That fundamentally, it's fundamentally an information problem. People were surprised, whether they chose to not ask the questions, but a lot of people were severely hurt by that. And I think that was something that was really interesting. I've been working on advanced manufacturing issues in the United States. And that's been another surprise, has been the decline of American manufacturing and how do we get American jobs and American growth back. And I think those are some examples of things which I have found just fascinating and compelling because they affect real people every day. And I think what happens if you're in the elite, and there's the elite that sort of runs the world, will talk to each other, and members here, obviously, all are members of this. And we talk to each other, but we don't appreciate the both positive and negative effect that we can have on people every day. And I think the stories of hardship are a good reminder of why what we do is so very important. That's why I get up in the morning. Yes, sir.
Oh. Daryl Black, DeKalb County, Georgia. I thank you for your time and your openness today. If you could you give me just a thumbnail SWOT report of Google?
In what context?
Just your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We pretty much covered the strengths.
Well, the first thing is we make lots of mistakes. Right, that would be an example. And I would argue that's a strength and a weakness. But people are always surprised when we make errors. Hopefully we admit them. We're trying our best. I think our weaknesses have to do with the fact that as we have become more middle-aged as a company, if I could say that, it's harder and harder to do completely new things. Right? It's just the nature of human beings. And when you start off as a company and you have everything's in front of you, but now because of constraints, and we have all sorts of other issues. Every government sort of has some group that's busy trying to figure out what we're up to, because information is power, and people care a lot about information. So we're quite disruptive, and in the course of that disruption, we tend to create enemies, which are hopefully not intended on our part, and hopefully we have a nice face to it. But the fact of the matter is we are disrupting industries, and that is a significant problem. Most of the other large companies have collaborations with us as well as competitions with us. And so depending on which day you talk to them, you'll hear good things or bad things. My basic objective with most of the corporations is to try to figure out a way to grow these industries. Because if we're all growing this huge industry that I'm describing, then there's lots of winning for all of us. And if we can't grow it, if it doesn't work, then it doesn't matter, right, whether we're nice about it or not. People are going to lose their jobs, and everybody's going to be upset.
Thank you.
Sounds like we have the last question. Yes, sir.
Hey, thank you, sir. C.J. Wallington from the Pentagon. I'm one of the lucky ones. I know my account executive, Jim Young. He's actually back here in the back. He's a great guy.
Thank you.
I've listened to Alan and Jeff speak earlier and talk about the difference between the private and the public cloud, and that's important to us because our requirements are a little more unique.
Of course.
But a lot of the security things you've addressed today touch upon the things that support the Guard and Reserve component as well. What do we need to do to engage you more, to become more successful in this government-industry partnership?
It's a hard answer because, as you know, because you work there, the procurement and industrial structures, the integrators and so forth, are a completely different breed from much of the commercial market. Different rules, different regulations, different ways in which things are installed, different histories, and so forth. I would observe that in the non-classified parts of the government, the needs are almost identical, ignoring that procurement set of issues. That basically the government is a service organization, again, in the non-classified parts, a service organization which needs to be as transparent as possible, as collaborative as possible, and operate as inexpensively as possible with as many different kinds of devices as possible, which is a perfect opportunity for Google. One of the things that I'm proud of is that when I was at Sun, we worked pretty hard in the 90s to get the government to adopt email, right? Because I don't know if people remember, but actually there were all these rules about using these standardized emails that nobody was. One of my big accomplishments was getting people to use @based email, right? So the fact that you could take the government and that with enough work and because of the scale, get people using email, starting using web services. Now, as you know, rules of the government services, everything has to have a website. And a number of us have worked hard, for example, in the openness rules for the government, again, for the non-classified parts, to use things like video more, to get more public participation in decisions and so forth. I'm part of the president's science team right now, and we just issued a report. The way we issued the first version of our report is we published it for comment, which as far as I know is the first time a government group has actually done that in the White House. Literally, they say, before we publish our real report, here are the things that we're thinking, can you comment back for us? And this is sort of a novel idea. So I think in all sorts of ways, the government should be a good user of this. With respect to the specifics, I think, let's work together on this. There are, most of the requirements can be achieved, the government requirements can be achieved with bridges between the old world and the new world, just as you do with a normal company. Right? So you have an old system that you have to bridge to, but nowadays we can make an interface using XML or the various data APIs and actually get that sharing to work.
Okay.
Right. I'm going to take one more quick question because we have a room full of talented people and they're concerned about their own careers, but perhaps even more important about how to mentor correctly to the people they're bringing up. Knowing what you know about where things are going, what do you think are the really great skills, relationships, talents, areas of study that they should focus on and seek?
I think the most important aspect of leadership in the modern age has to do with curiosity. And my experience is that most sort of people in my age don't really ask the fundamental questions, either because they're tired of the same thing or they're just not curious or what have you. When people say things to me, I actually check every single one of them. Obviously, I use Google, so I have a bias. But I would encourage you to start by challenging every single assumption. And I should say, by the way, that I learned this from Larry and Sergey. Because coming out of my enterprise background, and they walked in, and of course, they did not have an enterprise background when they started the company. they would challenge literally every assumption that I made. And I think that with modern technology, you can do that very, very seriously. You can really get to know the answer to the question. I think you'll be a much more effective leader. Your employees will respect you if you're on top of the details at that level. And by that, I don't mean telling them what to do. I mean knowing what's going on. So it's, are you present? Are you really paying attention? The second thing has to do with treating your employees as though they're actually intelligent. So the simplest rule is ask them a question rather than tell them what to do. And so if you can find a way to state it as a question, like, why are we paying $100 million and the other guys are paying 10? Right, that's a reasonable, that's like a criticism question, as opposed to go figure out a way to pay 10 million rather than 100 million. Right? You see the difference is actually quite fundamental. We run Google in an unusual way, of course. We run it in a collaborative style. And collaboration does not mean by consensus. Collaboration means that we sit in rooms until the best idea comes around and everyone agrees to the best idea and then we do that. So it's possible to actually run large organizations in a collaborative way based on the best idea as long as you have a shared set of values. The final comment I would make is that there are some very, very smart people in your organization that you don't know. Usually the smart people that are very low in the organization, the really, really clever ones, are sort of suffering because no one will really talk to them. Try to find them. Try to listen to them and try to have them be your beacons as to how the organization should evolve. They do exist, and they're often not among your direct reports. They're often deep. There's some incredibly clever idea 3 levels down that you just haven't heard. Look for it. When you hear it, jump on it and call for a special meeting or a special idea, or at least encourage it, because that will change the culture as well.
Change the room. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Eric.
Thank you so very much, and thank you for spending all day with us.
Okay.
Thanks, Ben.
All right.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you.
Dave, did you have closing words? Yes. I'm going to get